Before I begin, I feel it is necessary to point out that the news arm of the BBC has yet to retract, apologize, or otherwise address the deeply transphobic reporting it has engaged in the last few months. In a pinned comment down below, you'll find my original video on the topic, several videos from the YouTuber Sean, who has been ongoing in his pursuit of trying to get the BBC to own up to what they have done, and also a video from Laura Kate Dale showing the protests that have taken place outside of the BBC offices. While I don't feel any of the people behind Doctor Who are in any way responsible for this, I cannot in good conscience talk about a BBC-owned property without mentioning this first, until such time as it is properly redressed. Thank you. No matter what you think about a situation, there's always nuance. So with the ever more imminent end of the Chris Chibnall and Jodie Whittaker era of Doctor Who, I feel like it's maybe overdue for me to, well, kind of defend Chibnall a little bit. Now, let me be clear. My thoughts on Chibnall and his era are not only pretty well documented at this point, they are continuing to be documented as I do my rewatch of Series 11 and then probably Series 12 soon after that. So I'm not here to tell you that this stuff was secretly great, because I don't think that. I do, however, think that, especially among people who dislike this era, there are things that are worth taking into account. There were decisions made and aspects to the approach that Chibnall took that I think were not only defensible, but good ideas, at least on paper, even if the execution didn't pull it through. And I want to give credit where credit's due and also account for some of the difficulties in a way that maybe I haven't up to this point. Now, part of this is inspired by an interview that Chris Chibnall gave with the Radio Times, which was brought to my attention by Mr. TARDIS. I am cribbing a little bit from his video on the piece, so maybe check that out and throw him a few views. I promise I didn't just lift the entire thing. But the simple truth is that there are certain aspects to how Chibnall approached things that I think have either not been known or have been criticized by fans that I don't think is fair. And I'm going to be kind of jumping around on this. But one of the first things I want to tackle is I think there are those among us, especially who wanted to like his era and didn't, being very frustrated that there didn't seem to be much adjustment for what things the audience was saying was or wasn't working. So to address that, Chibnall said flat out he ignored the fandom. Now, there are those who would point to that as a mark of criticism for Chibnall, that, well, this is why everything failed. He wasn't listening to the fans. Except he also notes that not listening to the fans was a piece of advice given to him by both Russell T Davies and Stephen Moffat. Neither of them listened to fans either, and they advised him not to. Now, understand, listening to fans doesn't mean necessarily aggressively ignoring them, but just not going on fan forums, not watching the reviews. If you have something you intend to do that thing. And not only is that a piece of creative advice that I think generally makes sense, it makes more sense for Chibnall than for either of the other two. Here's what I mean by that. Chibnall came in wanting to do some pretty large-scale things. He obviously was planning stuff to pay off down the line. Now, we could argue all day over how well that did or didn't work, but the simple truth is the very notion of the timeless child or hidden secrets about the Doctor was planted in the very second episode of his era. The timeless child. Even though it wouldn't pay off until the finale of the following series. Well, I say pay off. It wouldn't get explained. I'm not sure it has paid off. But okay. I'm trying to not let my criticisms bleed into this too much. But the thing is, if you're planning on telling a continuous story, if you have an idea for something long term, it's even more important that you not get bogged down in the audience feedback and what they think is going to happen or what they think should happen. Because that's how you get Game of Thrones Season 8. And nobody wants Game of Thrones Season 8. Suppose I should give context for that just a little bit on the off chance that people don't quite know the connection. So, Game of Thrones season 8 was really bad on a lot of levels, but one of the big ones was that there were a whole bunch of story and character turns that seemed to exist for absolutely no reason other than it wasn't what the audience was expecting. And it was very clear that the two guys who were running that series had been paying a lot of attention to what the fans were saying, thinking, and more damningly speculating. And they seemed to go out of their way to just do things that would be unexpected for their own sake. The problem is, if you're telling a long continuous story and you've done the job decently, the reason fans are speculating a certain outcome is because that's what you've been building towards. And so subverting that isn't a surprise. It's just, wait, what? Or as the writer of the original books, George R.R. Martin himself put it,
if you've planned your book that the butler did it, and then you read on the internet, someone has figured out that the butler did it, and you suddenly change in midstream and it was the chambermaid who did it, then you screw up the whole book because you get this foreshadowing early on, and you've got these little clues you planted. Now they're dead ends, and you have to introduce other clues, and you're retconning. It's a mess.
So yeah, if you're trying to tell a longer term story, even if it's not completely serialized the way Game of Thrones was, it's probably important that you not get bogged down in fan response and reaction. I mean, heck, I'd actually argue it would have made more sense for either RTD or Moffat to pay more attention to the fans, since they were doing completely, well, more or less completely self-contained series. So by the time they got a response to, say, Series 3 or Series 6, it's already done and shot, and the next series is going to be its own thing. So I would actually argue that it might not be the end of the world for either one of those two to look into the criticisms or the praises and see what was work or what was going to work or what wasn't, because it wasn't going to necessarily directly impact intended story beats. And that's before we even get into the toxicity and the fact that Chibnall was getting death threats over the unforgivable sin of envisioning the Doctor as someone without a penis. At least we think the Doctor doesn't have a penis. Actually, we don't really know what Time Lords have going on in the downstairs department. That was a presumption on my end. Huh. You know what I mean, though. So, and I'm not going to dig into that anymore. I don't want this video to be about toxic fandoms, but you add that on top of it, it's super understandable that he was not paying attention to the fan communities. I think that was honestly not only a good choice creatively, but absolutely a good choice for probably his own mental health. And no matter who you are, whether you're praising or criticizing, you need to respect the fact that it's not good for creators to just be bombarded with feedback. So, yeah, that's a very defensible choice. Also, let's just briefly touch on the notion of the fact that he wanted story things to go over a longer term than just from series to series. That was a new direction, and I think one worth exploring. Again, I don't think he explored it very well, but as I said, under both RTD and Moffat, series were pretty solidly self-contained entities. You know, there was a story arc over that series. It ended. We move on to the next. Very few major plot points would carry over series to series to series. So to take a situation where, like, okay, we're going to plant some ideas here. We're not even going to touch them until the next series. That was a new way of approaching it. And coming in with newer ways to do it, which I would also include things like we're going to do the first series with no returning major villains. It's going to be all self-contained. We're going to try it with 3 companions. These are all solid enough ideas or ways to shake it up that aren't inherently so disruptive that it breaks the format, but are different ways of doing it that we haven't had in the modern era. Again, I don't think most of them worked, but I don't think there's anything wrong with these ideas inherently. And I think some of them are even good. I've said in the past, especially with Series 11, on paper, a lot of what Chibnall did is what I would have asked for. I would have asked for more self-contained stuff, less reliance on returning classic villains. This was stuff I myself might have even said we should do that if I was in charge of the show. And then he did those things, and again, but I think whatever strengths Chibnall has, I think most of them are in his broad stroke ideas, and most of the issues tend to come in execution. But let's talk about that execution a little bit, Because I think one of the things this actually exposes a weakness on, for something that we're about to get into, is that when you make plans to plant something now that you're not even going to pay off until next series, that unfortunately opens up the possibility that something's going to go wrong that throws your entire thing out of whack. Hence, COVID. Now, the biggest impact of COVID was on Flux, Series 13. There is very little doubt that COVID had a massive impact, probably on the number of episodes, definitely on the way they were written so that they could be shot in a way as COVID compliant as possible. And it does really, there's a lot of indicators that make it appear very strongly that the intention was to have more episodes than this, but just things fell apart. Ed Heim, who wrote episodes both for Series 11 and Series 12, one of my favorite episodes in Series 11 and one of the worst episodes of Series 12, talk about a roller coaster with this guy. He had, I don't think he said he'd finished the script, but he definitely had a full pitch for a story and was working on a full script for Series 13, but it was scrapped because with the way they were going to have to shoot and the number of episodes they were actually going to get, that episode simply didn't happen. And looking at Flux itself, it is very clear that some of those episodes were more or less intended to be self-contained. The big giveaways being the Sontaran episode and the one with the Weeping Angels, which are also the two strongest of that series. Although I didn't like the Weeping Angels one, but I still think it's more solid than a lot of what else is there. But it's very clear that those were probably meant to be standalone pieces that had the Flux overarching narrative grafted onto them. And the fact that it was grafted onto them, so it means that this was scrambling probably pretty late in the game. Now, I have criticized in the past that even knowing those restrictions, I still feel like this is sloppily put together, and I do stand by that. However, it is worth acknowledging these are massive complications, not only of changing what it is you think you can do with the series, but taking you from a position of thinking you're going to have more time, more episodes, and just a more relaxed shooting environment as an opportunity to tell your story and having pretty much all of that scrapped on you. The fact that Flux was made at all is kind of a miracle. Again, the actual results aren't great. It would be an amazing story if Flux was good. Like, if Flux actually worked all the way through, which I know for some people, at least it did. For me, it really didn't. But if it, really nailed it, this would be a story of absolute creative triumph under all these restrictions. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes the way things go wrong forces really innovative and unique creative solutions that make something better. But more commonly, when things go wrong, you can tell that something went wrong, and I think that's very much the case with Flux. But I bring it up because he made that series especially, and also the specials, lest we forget, under way less than ideal circumstances. That's something that I failed to acknowledge. Even when I did my full breakdown on Flux and how did it end up this way, I mostly focused on how the apparent compacting of the series really did the story no favors at all. And I think I really only did kind of a token acknowledgement of how difficult and how restrictive and how much of a moving target figuring that stuff out was. I still stand by every single criticism that I made, but I could have been a heck of a lot more fair in acknowledging exactly what the constraints were like, what kind of pressure this thing was under. And it's probably been a similar case for the specials. Like, The Legend of the Sea Devils is barely longer than a standard episode. And there is word that nearly 15 minutes were cut from it. Why? And at what point in the process? I don't know. I don't know if it was something that they were told before they even started shooting, but after they had a script, if it was something they were told while they were in the middle of editing the dang thing, who knows? But stuff really seems to keep going wrong. And one of the most frustrating things that I'll see people who have a conspiratorial bent to their content accuse Chibnall of trying to purposefully sabotage the show. If anyone is purposefully sabotaging the show, it's the BBC as a whole, not Chris Chibnall in specific. And I'm not saying the BBC is purposely sabotaging Doctor Who, but I am saying that the decisions being made at a higher level than Chris Chibnall had control over by the BBC were detrimental to this show. That, I think, is kind of indisputable. And the other thing is, for as much as I have and will continue to criticize this era of Doctor Who, it's gotten us some good stuff, some good characters, some good beats, some good episodes even. If I'm going to say in defense of Chris Chibnall, I should probably cite some specific things that I really enjoy. There are specific characters and casting decisions that I think work really well. Graham was great. Dan, I ended up liking a heck of a lot more than I thought, considering I really desperately did not want another modern time companion to be joining. And I especially didn't want another one joining in on Yaz and the Doctor when I wanted to see that relationship be built up more. But I like Dan. He won me over. I really like Sacha Dhawan as the Master. I love Joe Martin as the Fugitive Doctor, which is another thing that I think kind of suffered under the changing in shooting, how many episodes they were going to get, the way they had to shoot, etc. I have little doubt that there was an original plan to do a lot more with the Fugitive Doctor than we got. And I wanted and I still want so much more from her. But, after Series 12 introduced her, if she was supposed to show up more in Flux, and or after that, well, everything I've already talked about with the shooting of Flux. We've even had some good villains. I really like Ashad. I think he's a fantastic concept and an amazing performance. He's a really good villain, and I'm kind of excited that we're going to see him again in the final episode. Now, if I'm being honest, most of my favorite episodes of this era weren't written by Chibnall, at least not on his own. They were either written by other people or were co-written by Chibnall. But that having been said, they were still made under his tenure as showrunner. He fostered these stories. He helped them come about. So he deserves at least some credit for the fact that I got things like It Takes You Away, Can You Hear Me, War of the Sontarans, honestly, even Eve of the Daleks. I think that's probably the best one that he himself wrote. It was fun and energetic and a neat use of a time loop, which is something that Doctor Who has not done very much. And you think it would have been a time travel show, but that was good. War of the Sontarans might honestly be my favorite Sontaran-specific story of the modern era. The idea of using the historical settings to put more of a focus on eras and the things going on a bigger scale and a little bit less emphasis on individuals, even though a lot of times they were still there. I think that's the case with Rosa. That's definitely the case with Demons of the Punjab. And look, don't get me wrong. I'm not sad he's leaving. That was never in the cards. But given the fact that I've spent the last 3 or 4 years largely bashing on the guy, I think it would be unfair for me not to acknowledge there's been some good here. And that some of the things he tried are things I probably would have tried and or support in theory, even if the execution wasn't there. I don't think that about every decision he made, but it's important to be fair. So I call this a defense of Chris Chibnall. I mean, maybe it's not really. Maybe it's more of a let's be fair to Chris Chibnall. But that's not a nice clickbaity title, so I couldn't go with that. But yeah, I bitch a lot on this channel. I know that, especially when it comes to Doctor Who. I can be real picky, but I don't want anyone to ever forget that I love this show. And there have been moments within even Chibnall's time that I have loved. So, in the spirit of positivity, what is your favorite thing about Chibnall's era? It can be a bit of casting, specific episode, specific general idea. It can even be something that you love that I hate. It's all on the table. Whatever you think was good about his time as showrunner, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Oh, and please don't be the needless contrarian who's just going to go, there was nothing good. Work with me in the spirit of this, okay? If that's all you've got to say, just don't. But I do want to hear your thoughts. I want to know what people liked, whether it's what I liked or not. If you want to support what I can do, Patreon is how I make my living, and I'm able to do this full-time as my job. Any amount you can contribute helps, but there are other things you can do as well. Like, share, subscribe, help out this channel. quite a bit. The algorithm is very up and down on me lately. It hasn't been consistent for me in a while. But also, there's other things you can check me out on. I'm on Twitch, TikTok, Instagram. I have books for sale, fictional and nonfiction. But you don't have to worry too much about any of that. Because what I really want you to remember, in the spirit of positivity, is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. And credits. I gotta shout out my top Patreon supporters, so thank you very much to Zubin Lutfullah, Tarak, Oliver B., Melinda Walters, Leotha Boyd, TT, Vernobulax the Poodle, Eidolon, Tracy Scrabbit, Vincent Paul Bartolucci, Angry Caspro, Adam Lefty Taylor, Shane Ross, Robin Moore, Shayla Gourlay, and Brendan LaRose. Couldn't do it without you.